I'm just going to start us with a short karakia, which is a prayer, and it just to settle us in the space here. So, Pauhi hiri, pau rārama, pau o te whakaaro, te pau o te aroha, te pau e here nei a tātou, Māori ora ki a tātou, haumie, huie, tae ki e. Kia ora. So that was a short karakia to say, may this light and understanding guide us, and may the connections between us grow and be stronger in love and in the spiritual element that we have as people. So I just welcome you to share my slideshow, please, Hilary. And thank you for sharing. It makes it more possible for me to keep my notes in front of me. I'm the kind of person that gets quite excited about stuff, and it's very easy to go off on a huge tangent, but we don't have that much time today. So this will just keep me in check with you all and make sure that I can roll with what we have in store for us. So on the screen here, you'll see what Hilary's read out. We're talking today about constitutional transformation. I'll explain more what I mean by that, the movement here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and lessons from Te Urewera rainforest. Here you also have the pictures of two different mountains. One is Putauaki in the top right corner, and the other is Mangapohatu. These are the mountains that for me represent the people I come from and the landscape that me and my people come from. So I'm Ngāi Tūhoe and Ngātiawa. Those are two different tribes here in the east coast of the North Island of Aotearoa. And I'm also English and Welsh and Croatian. So that's the reality of our people these days. These mountains represent to me the landscape that I come from, and so I share them with you to show I'm more than just this individual in purple standing before you. I also come from the land, and that's a big part of what we mean by constitutional transformation. It's very much connected with the land and with how we relate to the land, and therefore how we relate to each other. Mountains show us two different things as well. They show us the permanence, their ever-presence through the generations, and the immutability of change in the sense that they have been the same since my greats were walking around. They've always represented home. They also show us the possibility of change from sunrise to sunset as the light falls upon them and the shadows fall upon them. Different parts of their bodies are illuminated, different parts disappear, and they demonstrate to us a hope that though there's such hugeness in their existence, that there's also this ability of change to perceive things differently and to learn things new from them. And so I feel that that is another good starting place to think about constitutional transformation, which of course is huge to change the constitution of a country, but it is not impossible. So if you just move to the next slide, please. I should also say, sorry, that I'm a co-lead of River, as well as being a lawyer. And I actually work a lot with some amazing people from the Yukon, Jodie Gustafson, Jenny Matchett, who I think are here today, Jocelyn Joe Strack, and Gillian. There's a bunch, this other guy, Mark Wedge, who you might know. He's a bit of a troublemaker, I understand. He's so I've had the joy of working with a lot of you online, and hopefully later this year I'll be over there in person. So on screen now is Pa Moana Jackson, and I would like to dedicate this lecture to Dr. Moana Jackson, Pa, who passed away last weekend. Moana Jackson is an absolute stalwart. He's a lawyer, he's a teacher, and a stalwart protector of Indigenous rights here in Aotearoa and of course globally. He helped draft the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. He reimagined a Māori criminal justice system here in Aotearoa in 1988, a long time before people were actually starting to move on these things. And he's led huge discussions on constitutional transformation throughout our Aotearoa. In the black, you can see a quote from a young student who had a conversation with Dr. Moana. And she said that one time she asked Dr. Moana what he thought the biggest thing the Crown took away from us through the process of colonization was. And he said belief. She thought that was a bit airy-fairy, but what came next was blew her away. He said, they took away our belief in our ability to make decisions for ourselves. They took away our belief that our language and our culture was worth retaining. They took away our belief that our systems and ways of living were good enough. So let's keep believing in ourselves. This talks to me, this quote talks to me, and there's lots of ways you can carry this. But it talks to me about how colonization has affected Indigenous peoples worldwide and what the work is ahead of us to transform our current realities. So yes, we suffered significant land loss, and that caused immense poverty for all of us and a cycle of stagnation. But colonization also intentionally attacked and undermined our social fabric, the core of what keeps us together. The practices that allow us to embody our indigeneity, for us maybe our tūhoetanga, our way of being, our spirituality, our value systems, how we relate to the world around us, our ways of coming together as a community to share space peacefully and to make decisions. So just like you are what you eat, you are what you do. So how we practice our lives affects who we are and our identity. And I think what he's telling us here is, and what he used to tell us when I was in law school, was be a Māori lawyer, not a lawyer who happens to be Māori. You know, he means be the values that you that steer you right, live in the right way. I think is more what you'd hear on your side of the world. So what he was challenging us to do in terms of constitutional transformation is to imagine beyond the current systems that we have. And this can be quite hard. We have to imagine beyond a parliament, imagine beyond a police force, imagine beyond prison systems, the way that power is exercised in our communities. And now it's more urgent than ever because with climate crisis and biodiversity decimation and ocean acidification, all of these things, as our Mother Earth, Papatuanuku, is calling for Indigenous values, Indigenous ways of relating to come back to the fore, to the heart of the Constitution, which is the way that we do things, the way we make rules for how we share space, how we make decisions, what we value as a community. And so this is what I'm talking about today, imagining beyond these existing power systems and to share 3 different ways that this is happening in Aotearoa. What I'm going to do is just go through a little bit of a overall overview so you know what's happening, this movement that's happening and being debated currently here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Share a couple of things that I have to mention about how this is happening, and then I'm going to dive into a case study example to try and pull a lot of those threads together so that we can see a little bit more 3D what this looks like on the ground. So thank you. Hilary will go to the next slide here. So this slide here ties us together in our histories, you in Turtle Island and us here in the bottom of the South Pacific. What do we mean by constitutional transformation? So one of our scholars here in Aotearoa, Tina Ngata, writes that to be born Indigenous is to be born into a political reality. How we are brought into this world, the way we are named, the language we speak, the security of our family, the means of education, everything around us is a site that speaks to us of our Indigenous survival or our colonial conquest. So Moana Jackson also points out that everything in life has a whakapapa. And whakapapa is our word for like genealogy, or to understand where things came from, how they connected and came to be. And so the Doctrine of Discovery is the source, if you like, the legal origin of our existing constitution that we have in Aotearoa and in Canada today. The Doctrine of Discovery, or what he means by understanding the whakapapa, is that instead of a tree, you can imagine colonization as a creeping weed, suffocating native growth, taking over all in its path. And as most gardeners will tell you, removing a weed from your garden takes significantly less effort if you take it out from the root rather than the many shoots of injustice. And so again, that's what we mean by why we focus on the Constitution in Aotearoa, is because we're trying to go to the root of the system and change everything that grows from it, being our law, how we govern ourselves. So the Doctrine of Discovery, I imagine this is familiar to all of you, but I'll just quickly introduce it. Was the international imperialism. It was the moral justification granted by the Catholic laws, the papal bulls, issued by the Vatican in the 15th and 16th centuries. And it gave the monarchies of Britain and Europe the right to conquer and claim lands and to convert or kill the native inhabitants of those lands. So it was like a moral sense of entitlement. This international law is what the English used to explore and colonize Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and other places around the world. So what this looks like today, so this is of course from the 14th, 15th centuries, and of course Canada or Turtle Island and Latin America were colonized about 400 years earlier than New Zealand, depending on where you are. What this enables, this Doctrine of Discovery, is the imposition of a Westminster governance system. So I think this is very similar to Canada, although you guys also have states that have their own governance, which is different for us. But we have, currently we have a parliament that holds parliamentary supremacy. So whatever is said in parliament goes. Like you, we have a government on one side of the building and then an opposition on the other side of the building. And their roles as government gets to make laws and the opposition gets to spend all its time ripping those down and arguing in the media and the politics that we're used to, which are considered normal today, that would be completely different to what we would have in an Indigenous system. The idea of having an opposition whose job it is to destroy everything that the government does is just such a waste of time in our minds. It just, Dr. Moana Jackson would just roll his eyes at that concept of energy being used in that way to make decisions for the benefit of a people in a country. So that's what we have right now. That's where a lot of our time and energy and money goes. We also have, just image-wise, an independent judiciary, a court system, where if you get in trouble with the law or you need to enforce something through the law, you go through the courts or tribunals, judges. We have a body of law that's been imported from the other side of the world, from England, the common law, that is now our law. And though it's grown from the other side of the world, it was simply picked up and placed here, formalized in 1947, and became our legal system. So we rely on values that have been imported from about 600 years of development in England on the other side of the world. Then we also have the executive branch, which in our country we call cabinet. I'm not sure, sorry if these are the same words or not. That's also related to the police force, which go out and enforce, usually enforce the law. International representation. So this is the group that gets to stand on the world stage and represent voices from Aotearoa, from these lands. They're not typically Indigenous voices or agreements, but they get to do that. There's also the army and other exercises of power. The point that I'm trying to show right now is what is normal is what we have to interrogate. What we see, this is what the Constitution looks like on the ground. This is how power is shared. This is how it's understood, and this is accepted as our normal. this is what we want to transform. This is what we have to imagine beyond. All right, we'll go to the next slide. This is a bit of a sad slide. So I've put some epic artwork there by Robin Kahukua. But the point of this slide is to just drive home, what this constitution results in for Māori realities. So despair is a good shorthand for the state that we are in. And I know that Aotearoa New Zealand has quite a wonderful reputation overseas, but this is some realities that probably aren't shared so much. We've had confiscation of our lands, waters and taonga, which are our treasured belongings, and it includes things like our language. Disconnection from our lands, our spirituality, our language, and therefore our identities, our culture and our legal systems. Generations of devastation and stagnation today, resulting in severe poverty, houselessness, high incarceration rates. So Māori make up these days about 15-16% of the population. There are about 5 million people here. And 51% of our male prisoners and 61% of our female prisoners. And we have a very high incarceration rate in New Zealand. I think it's 4th behind the United States. We have poor health and education outcomes. Māori tend to die 7 years earlier than non-Māori. And we have things, whānau violence and addictions, things that we would understand as breaches of our whakapapa. So our whakapapa, again, being our genealogy, how we connect back through our parents and our ancestors right back to Mother Earth and the Father Sky. This whānau violence, the way that we've internalized colonization and how it shows itself in our homes, is what we'd say a breach on that, because that was the most important thing to us, our family, how we relate. And now the way that our social fabric has been so disrupted that it is normal in our lives to have these things and suicide. And so I bring this up to show you what it's like, and also to tono, to mihi to you over in the Yukon, because I understand that some of these will be present in your communities as well. So this is more reason why we must transform our constitution and go to the root and not muck around with the shoots of injustice. We need to change it at the root. Yeah. The next slide. This is usually where people will start when we talk about our constitution. So this is really what I see as part of the start of Māori resistance for tino rangatiratanga, and I'll teach Hillary that word later. No. Tino rangatiratanga means self-determination. It is sovereignty. Rangatira in that first part of the word is like a leader or a chief. And so tino rangatiratanga is the top sovereignty. So our ancestors were aware of what was happening when the English arrived. In 1814, the missionaries first arrived, so much later, I think, than Turtle Island. And then in 1835, we declared independence. And this flag is the first flag that we had as the Māori people. And we used to have it on trading ships, because by that time, Māori were already sailing around the world, trading. We were going all around the world in our own boats. Our economy was pumping, actually. We had a bit of a honeymoon period, as people describe it in our history, when the British first arrived, before they had the numbers to colonize. And next to it is a tattered old document called Te Tiriti or Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi. And that is considered the foundational constitutional document between Māori and the Crown. And so I can't talk today without mentioning these two documents. The way I see them, because these are absolutely essential documents to the success of Māori resistance legally and transformation in the Crown. But I see them as our people coming together and saying, these English folk don't seem to get that we're the bosses here. So we better write it down in their language and their way and send it to them. You know, this wasn't necessarily our culture to write down things. But this was our way to say, oh, here we're independent, and 5 years later in 1840, okay, we have an agreement where we retain our independence, and you guys will grant you some power of governance so you can look after your people that are here. The idea of imposing our ways on newcomers wasn't part of our culture. Of course, what followed, and you can see it by the state of this document, that it's been ripped apart and left in a basement for over 100 years before we came back to it, was the confiscation, the land wars, all sorts. We won't go through it today, but that's part of the history. So it's very essential that I raise these two things. Yes, thank you, Hilary, that's perfect. These next two slides are really my way of showing Māori resistance over the years, and to acknowledge in this academic space and this legal space that art and activism were absolutely core to our resistance. And I want to make the point that they are core to our ongoing transformation, the way that we express ourselves and show our dissent and show our strength as a practice. When we say you are what you do, it's a practice of our sovereignty. It's a practice of being who we are. And so these are some very old flags. Te Tiriti was a famous warrior back in the 1860s and 50s, 60s, 70s. And these were two of his flags here. And the top one is a letter written in 1872 from some of my tipuna. They're called the 70 chiefs of Tūhoe, who wrote to the crown and basically said, this is our space, you guys need to get lost, in a much more eloquent way. So the next slide, thank you, Hilary, is another photo of our Tino Rangatiratanga flag. So that's our sovereignty flag that was created for our identity and resistance and liberation. That's in the top left. There's pictures of protests here and leadership. So you can see the energy that was created. This is in 1975 in the bottom left. There's a huge thousands of people crossing the harbour bridge, the Land March of 1975, where their call was not one more acre. We have on the top right, Tamiiti. He's a really well-known figure in Māori resistance. And above him, it says Māori control of Māori things. That was in the 70s too. And below him are some photos of the wahine, or the woman that led Eva Ricard, the kuia, the grandmother, Whenekupa, and Te Whai Harawira, just some other leaders of the movement on the ground to create transformation, the energy that was needed in the 60s and 70s, which was really inspired by the Black civil rights movement in the United States. And this time, this era in the 60s and 70s is often referred to as the Māori Renaissance. It's when our Māori people as a big group woke up and remembered the Treaty of Waitangi, remembered our right to sovereignty, and started marching and started flying flags and started really resisting. So it's would be remiss of me not to acknowledge this history as we talk about the constitutional changing. So we'll move on to this next slide. Oh, good, we're making quite good time. It's good. Awesome. So before I move on to look at a case study, I wanted to acknowledge these other three really crucial parts. And this is, I think, very important for an Indigenous governance system and talking about what's happening right now in New Zealand. So all that energy and that we saw on those earlier slides, that led to a huge shift in our law where the government realised they're going to have to do something. It's not going to do anymore to just pretend like Māori are going to be brown versions of Pākehā people and assimilated into a Western society. Now they need to acknowledge and do something. So they, in 1975, created the Treaty of Waitangi Act, and they created this group called the Waitangi Tribunal, where in 1985, they gave it retrospective powers to look at everything that had occurred in Aotearoa, from the confiscations, the genocide, everything, where the government had to acknowledge what had happened. Historians pull up all of this information, acknowledge what happened, and in a reconciliation package called a treaty settlement in New Zealand, there's an apology, there's a return of some resources and acknowledgements of relationships between people in place, and then there are some co-governance opportunities. So all of that energy got channeled into this new process of the tribunal and the settlements in 1985, especially from there. And in 2022, we're nearing the end of the treaty settlements. There are over 100 iwi or tribes in New Zealand. And so we've gone through every single one. This is not a perfect process, and I could spend a whole lecture explaining what it looks like. I could spend days talking about this whole slide, but it's important to know that this was a chance for our people to come to lay out everything that had happened, for the government to recognise, and a lot of our people actually say the apology and the acknowledgements are some of the most powerful reconciliations and things that we need to hold Crown to. Then the opportunity for co-governance has given rise to basically where we are today. The strength within the Māori community to actually keep pushing for transformation rests now on this new reality that we are post-settlement. So that's our context, say. This next piece here called Lex Aotearoa, mapping the Māori dimension of the law. This is more for any of your law nerds out there in the crowd today. And I need to mention it here again. It's something I could spend a lecture talking about. But Lex Aotearoa is basically a theory put together by Justice Joe Williams, who's the Māori judge in the Supreme Court. He's the highest judge of Māori descent that has now reached the Supreme Court. And he describes our legal system, which of course is how we share, how we relate to each other, in 3 chapters. And this is, again, a context thing. So our first law before colonisation, he termed Kupe's law. That's our Māori legal system, untainted. Then he would describe the second law as being the imposition of a colonial system, where everything that came before that was ignored and scrapped. And now he describes us as being in this era of a third law, where the first law of tikanga Māori, or Kupe's law, is becoming woven into the Western legal system. So that's our other current reality, is that concepts from our legal system, which I'll share more about in our case study, have been now intertwining into our Western legal system. So these are things like kaitiakitanga, which is a term that refers to stewardship of the land, where when you make decisions in relation to land, you take the priorities, the needs, and the intimacy of knowledge with the land above any human desire to develop. That's a legal principle from our law that is now being woven through our Resource Management Act. And so we're in this era right now, we're experiencing judges who are typically Pākehā people making decisions and being advised by Māori people about how tikanga might appear and might be relevant for their decision. And this is both very exciting for lawyers at the moment, that this is being recognised. Just last year, the Supreme Court recognised tikanga Māori as its own legal system, valid in and of itself. And it's also very scary to be passing over a whole lot of our values and our legal system over into a Western system and watching that carry out. Because at the end of the day, even with all the advice from Māori people, the structure is still a Pākehā judge typically making a decision and developing the law. So judging our legal system. So there's a lot of risk involved there. So the third thing on this slide, I apologise for throwing all of this at you, but it needs to be done to share with you what's happening here, is the third sort of aspect of our context here, which is Mātike mai Aotearoa. So Mātiki Mai is really all about absolute transformation at a constitutional level. And that's where it differs from that second Lex Aotearoa. It differs because instead of weaving things together, it's asking for plural systems. It talks about spheres. So you would have a tino rangatiratanga sphere, which is a Māori sphere of governorship, a kawanatanga sphere or realm, which is where the government sits, and then a relational sphere between them, which is how they come together to make decisions. And so this is known as a plural legal system. I think in Canada you have this with a French legal system and an English legal system. Certainly in places like Vanuatu, there are multiple places around the world where there are dual legal systems. In Vanuatu, for example, there's an archipelago of 86, I think, different islands, and it's not practical for a Western legal system to govern all of that. So there are many, many islands that operate in accordance with tikanga. So this is the idea that we would have our own governance within our country and still share space with the crown and that heritage that came through. So you can tell that is a whole nother lecture. And so what I want to do now is, instead of diving into all of these three things, I want to use the case study of Te Urewera to help try and bring all of these things together and explain a little bit more about what I mean by the legal systems developing and the constitution therefore changing. So just go to our next slide. Great. So this case study is very close to my heart because it is about one of my iwi, Tūhoe. And on screen is a famous photo of our place in the world. This is the Ohine Mataroa River. There's some of our people crossing the river on horseback, very common scene up that river in particular. And behind it, you'll see a deep, dense rainforest known as Te Urewera, which Hilary's introduced us to. So Tūhoe are known as the children of the mist. Our history is that we come from the mist, Hine Pukohurani, who is the mist maiden, when she married the mountain, who was a comet that she seduced to come to earth and became a mountain. And they had a child called Pōtiki, who is our eponymous ancestor. So if anyone ever asks Tūhoe where we're from or how long we've been here, which is a common question in the Western world, we say since the mist married the mountain. That's how long we've been here. So the next slide, please, Hilary. What happened is, this is Aotearoa, the North Island at least, or known as Te Ika Maui. And in the sort of bigger map, you can see the boundary of Te Urewera rainforest. So it's all black with the colourful things in between. We'll ignore those colours for now. But that is Te Urewera. That's the size of her. She's a huge, immense rainforest, about 212,000 hectares. In the south, she has an incredible lake called Waikaremoana. If you come here, you'll need to go there. It's stunning. It's high in the mountains and it's a deep, beautiful lake. Te Urewera has very steep mountainous ranges. So when Aotearoa was being carved up and colonised, it wasn't possible to turn this forest into a farm, which is pretty much the rest of our country, and really sheep farms and definitely dairy farms, or kiwi fruit. So Te Urewera was left alone, and in the 50s she was declared to be a national park. So in some ways that can, when you look at the normal way that Western world and Western law operates, a national park sounds like a good thing because you're setting aside a place to be conservation land and cared for in a way. But we would describe this as one of the most devastating things that could have happened to our people, because it disconnected us from our homelands. And it put between us a wall of new authority that was imposed, and it stopped us from gathering the food we would traditionally gather, from practicing the rituals we would traditionally be practicing. We were some friends of mine have talked about having to dodge rangers just to be in that space and to practice their ways of being for fear of being fined. Our whole relationship with our mother, Te Urewera, our land base, was completely devastated. And so over generations, you can imagine the disconnection growing and the intimacy with the land, the understanding of how the land operates and how that informs us as to the kinds of people we are, the inspiration we draw from the land, was disconnected too. So this is my homeland. The other thing I'll share is the North Island is Te Ika a Maui, the great fish of Maui, and this is the heart of Maui. So I'll just move to our next slide because I can see we're probably getting close to our time. So this is my pausing to dive a bit deeper into the differences between a Tūhoe legal system and a Western legal system. So law, as we've been talking about, we often picture a parliament. When someone says law, it's normal to picture a parliament or a police force or a giant book, but that is just a Western conception of law. Law really, at its heart, is about how we relate to each other, how we relate to the land, and how we relate to each other. So what are the rules around our relationships? Who gets to make decisions where, and what values are you using to base those decisions on? How do you guide yourself? So in a Western legal system, as we've sort of been talking about, you have the way that you relate to the land is as an owner to a property or as a manager to a resource. It is a hierarchical system where humans are put on top, and all of our law relates through that. It is a patriarchal system too, and it is anthropocentric, where it prioritizes the role of the human and the needs of the human, the convenience, over anything else. It centers the human in decision making. Indigenous legal systems, by difference, relate to the land as a child to mother. And that is actually our biological reality too, and historically. The earth was here first. We came later. And so it recognizes that relationship where that's our mother. All that we need is drawn from the earth. We cannot exist without her. She can exist without us though. And that's how we relate to her. And so that becomes our priority. It is a reciprocal relationship. It's not hierarchical. There are benefits and there is emotion that is exchanged spiritually. There is relationship with the land. It is more than a resource. In fact, the term resource would be considered arrogant to define something, the living systems that are so complex and ancient, to define that as a resource or as a simple property that we can simply own, like any other household item that you can trade as a commodity, would be considered arrogant where I'm from. It is a matriarchal system. I won't go into those differences, but what we would describe it as kincentric. So instead of anthropocentric, which we've said is centers the human, and instead of ecocentric, which we've heard and centers earth, it's kincentric, which centers the relationship between the human and the earth. And in that sense, make sure that we confirm we are of the earth, we are the same, there's no distance between nature and humans, we are nature. And so kincentric legal system as a word is actually an English term for this idea of whakapapa, which I keep bringing up, the connection between us and the earth. And so a kincentric, it focuses on how do we relate. And so, yeah, I'll just move on now. So, this next slide is a long quote. Sorry, Hillary. As a long quote, which just basically reinforces what I've shared about the law. And this is by Vine Deloria Jr. And my friend Jody actually found this. So thank you, Jody, if you're there. And just briefly, it just basically reinforces this idea that the natural world, our present view of the natural world has no place for natural features and entities themselves. Physical entities that support life, such as air, water, and land, are conceived in a legal sense as if they had no existence apart from the human legal rights that had been attached to them: property, resource management. So we could easily and legally destroy all life without ever violating the Constitution provisions regarding protection of property, which is how we relate in our current Constitution to the earth. So it would be legal to destroy everything in some ways. So our present conception of property revolves around our use of it. That's what I mean by the arrogance, not around its existence as an element of the universe in its own right, which talks about the spirituality, the life force, the complex living systems that is nature. Nature has no rights of its own in our legal system. If our legal system reflects our view of reality, then we believe that we exist over and apart from the legal world. So if we move to the next, this is really the case study. And Te Urewera, that giant forest, became a national park in the 1950s. As part of our treaty settlement, which we've briefly touched on, Tūhoe negotiated and succeeded to have the whole forest declared to be a legal person. And this is becoming more popular around the world. And what that means is that no human owns this piece of the land anymore. She owns herself. She is now a legal person with all the rights, powers, and liabilities of a legal person, just like a company is, and just like a human is. And she, in this legal personhood, what we are saying is that we reject the idea of ownership, which we deem as arrogant. We still operate within a Western legal system. We're going to be innovative in how we create space now to call this a legal person. Nobody owns her now. This is more akin to how we relate to the land. It's almost like a loophole in the Western legal system that gives rise to a Tūhoe legal system to operate. It's creating space for us to breathe. So in the Western legal system, this is very, very new, the idea that no human could own the earth, that she owns herself. And so it's creating a space for us to now start to create our own laws. So we'll move to the next slide, which is what our laws are starting to shape up to be. So this happened in 2014, so not long ago. We created, to start shaping the space now, we created what's known as the management plan, or is called Te Kawa o Te Urewera. So Te Kawa is about management of people for the benefit of the land, not land management.
I phoned RCMP too.
She has to say
sorry. So in that sense, instead of resource management, we are recognizing that the land has been here for way longer than us, that the pressure that comes onto the land, the impact, is caused by humans. The land knows what she's doing. She's been here for millennia. She's evolves and transforms over millennia. Humans are the ones applying the pressure and the impact from climate change right down to cutting tracks on her body for our own convenience of access, right? So it's humans that need the management, not the land. She knows what she's up to. So this management plan flips a normal Western concept and says human management for the benefit of the land. And this is radical. And it's really inspiring. And after this lecture, I'll make sure to share with Hilary some more information for people to read through. But as was on the sort of previous slide, Tūhoe says, deliberatively, we are resetting our human relationship and behaviour towards nature. Our disconnection from Te Urewera has changed our humanness. We wish for its return. So what that's saying in terms of constitutional power is we've shifted power now away from a Western legal system only of resource management towards a new space, still exists within parliamentary sovereignty. So it's not the transformation that Matariki Mai is talking about, but it is a huge shift of power that now we have a space, a territory that is governed by this worldview of human management for the benefit of the land. Okay, this next slide here, just quickly, is a bit more of the co-governance realities of how this works, given this is an Indigenous governance speaker series. So what it looks like, apart from the law that's changed, is we have now a board that speaks on behalf of Te Urewera. She's the voice of Te Urewera. There are 6 Tūhoe and 3 Crown representatives, which is very unique. Usually it's 50-50, if not more Crown representatives. Then the first purpose of the Act is to strengthen and maintain the connection between Tūhoe and Te Urewera. And if you recall, we talked about disconnection as being the biggest thing to have disrupted our way of being, our belief in ourselves. Well, that's recognised in this Act by adding the first purpose is our reconnection, our connection, strengthening that, strengthening our intimacy with the land, which is where our legal concepts, our relationships, our knowledge of how to do things comes from. There's also this idea of friendship agreements, which I think is a neat way to again demonstrate what this looks like on the ground. So usually, say you're a tour group and you want to go into the forest and make some money by taking a tour group in there, you show them the forest, take them out. Usually you'd pay a fee to the manager to be able to do that. And you can see that as a transaction between humans only. The land itself isn't part of that agreement. Friendship agreements is the new way that you have relationship in Te Urewera, if you're not from there, is you have to have a friendship agreement with the forest in order to be able to go there for a commercial purpose. And so what that means is, people go, what? So I have to be friends with the forest? What do you mean? So, well, you've got friends, don't you? How do you relate to your friends? You share with them, you understand their needs, you reciprocate. And so that's what it's a bit noisy. That's what this friendship agreement system is. Finally, there are, of course, some tensions getting this started. There's tensions between the governance entity. We're decolonizing ourselves. So, of course, there's all these issues around training ourselves, getting ourselves up to speed, trust, developing that belief in ourselves. Concepts of lateral violence are ever present in this new era as we try and come back to what it means to be self-governing. And so this point, self-governance requires healing first, is really what I'm seeing in this new era of transformation. Is as a people, we need to learn how to believe in ourselves. So these final 2 slides, we'll just go through them. Thanks, Hilary. This is a beautiful painting, again, by Robin Kahukiwa. This is really what I want to leave us with, is we must love ourselves again. On it, she says, me ata whakarongo ki tō tātou manawa e kapa kapa ana. So we need to listen very carefully to the pumping of our own hearts, the beat of our own hearts. That's her message. So even though we have this legal infrastructure in place now, our work, our starting place is to reconnect to who we truly are. So we have all of this in place, and now we need to remember, who are we? How do we relate to the land? How do we live? How we live impact on the land and the water, the trees, the insects? What does this mean to us now in 2022? As we're not going back to 1840, what does it mean for us now as Indigenous people in this reality of ours? And what responsibilities do we have now? These are the kinds of starting points on the ground that we have to return to, is understanding ourselves and our place in this. And the final painting is one and a reminder that we are still here. And this is the courage and the aroha that we are still here, and that our very existence is an act of resistance. So with that, I just want to mihi to you all and thank you all for having me today. Thank you for putting on these series to give space to talk about these things. And I hope that in all of that, some things landed and came through. And if there are any questions, of course, I'd be happy to take those too. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think there are some questions. I'm seeing one here in the chat.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Has there been any challenge to this by other entities? Examples, humans seeking to overturn the ruling and extension of personhood so as to purchase or develop the land?
Sorry, within Te Urewera itself?
Michelle, I'm not sure if you're on, just to clarify.
Oh, sorry, I can see the question now. No, there hasn't been any challenge, thankfully. I think that would be extremely difficult now to challenge Te Urewera, because it's now an act of parliament. Politically, it would be very, very difficult. But say if you wanted to go into the forest, say you just went into the forest and you cut down a tree because it's valuable wood, you wanted to build something beautiful, you could be sued by the forest herself. She has standing now to take you to court and sue you. And there's jail time and there's huge fines for that kind of behaviour. Also with the board being 6 Tūhoe and 3 Crown, that's a huge push towards the governance of it being based on Tūhoe principles and values. And so you would have to reckon within that legal system in order to be able to have any exploitative relationship. I simply can't see it happening unless the act is overturned, thankfully. Yeah.
We probably have time for one question maybe, or comment, or something if someone wants to join in the conversation.
I'm happy to hang around too, though I know you guys might need to go. So.
Now there is a question. Okay, actually, yeah, Constantine.
Hey.
I had a question in regards, so like the forest has kind of legal a legal entity. Does water also have some kind of right or legal identification?
Right, that's a good question, and a hot topic in New Zealand at the moment. It does have, it is protected within the legal personhood of the forest, because we, in our understanding of the living systems, see the interconnection between all of it. Though in Western law, as in Canada, you'd separate land from water, from trees, from minerals. They're all kind of dissected like science, you know. So under this, we have a protection for water. It would be very difficult to go and to exploit the water there. But throughout all of New Zealand, there's a huge debate. There's actually 5 cases currently in the courts about ownership of water and whether there is native title in water, whether Māori can own water, or whether nobody owns the water. So currently the Crown argues that nobody owns the water. And unfortunately, Māori have to argue that we own the water, even though, this is a bit nuanced, even though we would say ownership is arrogant, as I talked through, we have to keep operating within this Western system. And so the closest thing to our relationship with water and our ability to make decisions has to be akin to ownership. There's nothing else that we can create in our Western legal system to recognise our actual relationship with water. And so legal personhood doesn't really do that for us unfortunately. There has been legal personhood over rivers in Aotearoa and around the world. But again, when it comes to water itself and the extraction and use and disposal into, is sadly not captured by that same imagination. It's very political right now. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. It's a big kind of, I don't know, but I wish.
Thank you for the answer that you gave. So it's not necessarily connected to so how forests have kind of legal rights or whatever. Is it kind of, is there any, like, were you saying that it was branched where it kind of encapsulates a number of things like water and maybe animal rights, or I don't, like, you know how in our society things are compartmentalized in different areas where but yeah, it kind of brings up a really interesting topic of like nature in general and how we kind of conceptualize it and like what it kind of means. And but were you saying that water is kind of a branch of the legal protection, or is it kind of separate from such things?
I think water is intertwined. So the legal personhood protects the territory of the forest, which includes at least 2 massive rivers and watersheds. And so the way that we talk about it is more as the living system of the forest, which of course includes water. And so in that sense, it is protected in the legal personhood. Because if anyone goes within the boundaries of that territory that's now a legal person, they fall under the legal system, the Tūhoe legal system of Te Kawa. So, so it's intertwined. And absolutely what you say about it being in the Western system being broken up into smaller bits, and in the Māori system, you see everything is interconnected. It's not really practical to break things up because it's artificial in the sense that all of us are made of water. In our language, when I ask you, who are you? I'm asking you, what water are you? Like, you are water. It's our language. Ko waio is who am I? And ko waio means I am water. And so that is an essence of our concept of our reality, is that water is everything. And so in our legal system, of course, that's reflected too. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We are over time.
Yes.
Alan, I know that you put a question in the chat. Erin, I mean, I want to thank you so much. And I know people are sort of leaving as they need to. There was one more question in the chat. Are you okay to?
I'm fine, yeah.
All right. We'll take you up on the offer. So Alan, what do you think of IPCAs?
That's from Alan?
Yeah, Alan, you're still there. Do you want to just jump on?
Yes, it's called IPCAs, but it's Indigenous protected and conserved areas. And it's something that they're doing in Canada. Several First Nations, I think they negotiate with the territorial or provincial governments and the federal government.
Right.
And they protect certain areas of their territories. I guess it's not quite as good as yours because yours is constitutionally protected, eh?
Well, actually, our good friend Gillian has taught me a little bit about IPCAs, and you're right. I'd agree with you, Alan, that even though this is obviously a huge movement and we honor all the ancestors of ours that brought us to an ability to have recognition on our lands, let alone some decision-making rights, I still argue we're not there yet, because that we're stuck within these Western legal systems and governance systems, which require us to squeeze all of our relationship, all of our concept of creation and our relationship to nature into a human-made, man-made system where we have to negotiate and trade and compromise with values that don't echo our own values. So legal personhood is probably a step on from the IPCAs in the sense that we have a board where there's the majority of Tūhoe, and that we get to create and be creative about our legal system over the whole territory. But we're still at the mercy of parliamentary supremacy. If the wrong government gets into power and they have the political will, they could repeal all of it and we'll go right back to being removed from our land. So even though we celebrate everything that we've achieved, and I'm so grateful to be living in an era where this is our landscape to work with, there's a lot in terms of really being able to live in the right way, in our truth, that we are compromising, we have to compromise on in order to survive within this Western legal system. So yeah, that's where I stand on that. I'm glad that there's movement, and I'm sad that they don't get that. If we learned how to relate in the Indigenous way, that this isn't race-based politics where now brown people take over, for example, right? It's actually a whole new value system and worldview where we see the land as more than just a property and a resource. We see her as an ancestor, as something that has rights and in and of herself, that she has value in and of herself. And that determines how we relate to her, how we make decisions. So would you, if you related to her as a mother, would you allow a foreign water bottling company to come in and mine water and take all of it and sell it, billions of plastic bottles overseas? Under our Western legal system, yep, totally. Yep, you can do that because no one owns the water, and we don't recognize the value or the spirit of that ancient aquifer that we're talking about. In a Māori legal system, you would say, no way, that water is from this land. That's our past and it's our future. It's us, you know, that, and so our decision would be no, but we can share in relation to the needs and the requirements of that water body because we prioritize its life. And so on a climate change level, you can imagine the kinds of decisions we'd be making in terms of fossil fuels and exploiting the land would be completely different if you were able to lead from an Indigenous perspective. And just to finish that thought, it doesn't mean that we cannot develop. It doesn't mean that there's a halt on everything will develop and that we return to some sort of Stone Age, which is what some right-wing arguments are over here in Aotearoa. Actually, what it means is that we prioritize the needs and the boundaries of the earth and her living systems as we make decisions which will impact them for future generations. It's just another way of looking at everything. So we can still build houses. We just don't do it with toxic, poisonous materials. You know, we do it in relationship, in alignment with the living systems of the planet. Yeah. Thanks, Ellen, for that question. I could go on forever about that. Thank you.
We have more questions in the chat. I think we could go forever.
Great.
Can we go till 1:15?
I'm happy to stay. I recognize that
okay.
I've talked for a while, so I'm happy to have questions. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll keep reading them because they keep coming. Okay, Panama seems to be doing something similar. Are there any more resources that we can look into for something here in Canada?
All right, so definitely. So Panama, Bolivia, Ecuador, I'm not sure so much about Panama, sorry, but Bolivia and Ecuador have enshrined all of Pachamama, their word for Papatuanuku, Mother Earth, as a constitutional entity that has her own value and rights innate of herself. So their constitutions have already changed to recognize the value of the earth. The problem that they face is the multinational corporations and the exploitation that those bring to those developing countries, which are dependent upon capitalism, global capitalism. And so they are at the mercy of the governments being able to stand on that constitution and protect the earth. But at the moment, the power of the multinational corporations is taking over. So while the legal infrastructure is there, the political willpower to enact it is not possible or not there. There's also this thing you could Google called the rights of nature, which is taken around the world. So rights of nature is something to look into, which also talks to the idea of Papatuanuku, the Earth Mother, as having her own legal protections. The only comment I'll make there is what we need to consider is, yes, rights for nature, but also human responsibilities to nature. So how we reciprocate is really important to recognize that humans don't just grant rights to nature and say, you're welcome. We, in doing that, are recognizing practically our responsibility to nature, that we are the ones causing impact on her body, and that we are the ones that need to take responsibility for those things. So in our decision-making, in our governance, and the laws that we develop, we recognize our responsibility to make decisions beneficial to the land and manage ourselves accordingly. So yeah, rights of nature, Ecuador, and then legal personhood of rivers is really, really big, which is another interesting way of looking at it. And even legal personhood of the moon is another topic you could look to if you're interested in this. Yeah. So.
How about one more question?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, all right. Is there any mechanism for a designated living entity to address climate change, to require action of governments to address adverse impacts from climate change?
Well, I mean, so hope so, and this is again, I suppose, talks to me about how we're having to live within this constitutional reality globally that stems from that doctrine of discovery, this idea that humans are hierarchically superior to the land, and all of our law and our commerce, capitalism, is stemming from this genesis of what I would call arrogance, human arrogance, that we as the last born of nature's children, if you consider the trees and the birds and the insects and ocean animals as being older than us in terms of when they were created, we're the youngest, and we are the ones just destroying everything for our own convenience. When you really think about it, how we trade food, the kinds of foods we want to eat, that we import them around the world, our use of fossil fuels, all of that stuff. So that's what's given rise to climate change. Isn't necessarily just fossil fuels, which we're often targeted toward. It's our arrogance and our superiority complex that we are disconnected and superior to the earth, if that makes sense. So that's what we have to target, is the cultural values. So in terms of a legal entity that will help protect the earth from climate change, legal personhood's probably, for me, the most powerful example that I've seen of that power shift towards a better way to relate to the earth. If you understand law as being how we relate to the earth. But unfortunately, like this question about governments globally, that sits at international law under the United Nations, it sits with treaty making, and therefore it sits with politicians and ambassadors and people who are vying for political power among humans. And so the rights of nature or the responsibilities towards her are really taking a second seat, if not further down, on the conscience of government to actually create change. So there's no real legal mechanism today that forces governments to make any change for climate change. And so I take hope in the work that's actually happening in Yukon and the fellowship there with the climate change fellows. And I can see someone there, kia ora Carissa and everybody. And what I see them doing there is really pushing towards reconnection as opposed to disconnection. Our battle with climate change is a moral one. It's a spiritual one. The earth is demonstrating to us that she's had her fill of our arrogance, and we need to reconnect to be able to have any impact or hope to save her. And I'm not sure if this is any consolation, but the earth will survive this. It's where the humans will, you know. And the earth is going to continue living on. She's been through hotter and colder climates. It's our humans that are really, and the rest of the animals that rely on this climate that are at risk here. Yeah, sorry, I can go on a big tangent with that. I get quite upset. But yeah, currently an answer, no legal mechanism that's really forcing anybody to do anything. It's only moral mechanisms. New imagination, that's what we need. Our governments. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think you can see by the number of questions and comments and people still staying. Thank you so much for your time today. Yeah.
Thank
and
you,
I think we'll have to invite you back.
Oh, that'd be delightful. I'd love to. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou, mauri ora kia tātou. I have a karakia to close us off, if that's appropriate. Just a short prayer.
Mm-hmm.
Say to put the kōrero up. Whakaere ake te ki te kōrero ki te pau tuarongo, hei tiki anō mo muri ake nei, kia wāte ai, kia tīna, haumi e hui e, tae ki e. Kia ora everyone, masicho. Thank you very much.